Episode 7, Exploring Matthew. A second-hand word-of-mouth report from the 2nd century martyr Polycarp claims that Matthew's Gospel was written by Matthew the Apostle and translated from the Hebrew into Greek. So this report would identify the author as the apostle and former tax collector called Matthew in the Gospel itself, but Levi in Mark's Gospel. Now this is of course possible and reflects the early church's concern to establish the authenticity of Gospel texts by tracing their sources to identifiable eyewitnesses. However, this looks less plausible when we put the Gospel side by side with Mark and look closely at the texts. One thing we can notice is the very close relationship between Matthew and Mark throughout the Gospel, both in the choice of incidents to narrate and in the choice of words to narrate the incidents. This looks too close to be accidental and prompts the question, who came first? We've already seen that Augustine simply assumed that Matthew came first, but again, this looks less likely when we consider two things: the dramatic architecture of the two Gospels and the quality of language. There are many slight differences in language choices between Matthew's and Mark's Gospel, but in the case of Matthew, it is always in the direction of more elegant Greek. It seems more likely then that Matthew used Mark's Gospel or a Gospel like it and improved the Greek for the benefit of his audience, than that Mark used Matthew and deliberately made the Greek rougher, though that is not impossible. Then there is the structure. Matthew shares much of Mark's structure, moving from the baptism of Jesus through the miracles that reveal who he is, first in the Jewish, then in the Gentile territories, culminating in the moment where Peter recognizes Jesus as Messiah in the far north of the country. After that, as in Mark, we have the journey to Jerusalem, accompanied by prophecies of suffering and death. However, Matthew's Gospel constantly breaks up that taut, dramatic structure with large blocks of teaching material, the most famous of which is the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew seems less bothered about the drama and the action. It looks more as though he is exploiting what he believes to be a basically reliable, pre-existing biographical narrative. What he wants to do is situate a large amount of Jesus' teaching drawn from other sources in the context of that narrative. This is a second literary reason for thinking that Matthew's Gospel was written after Mark's. Matthew was using Mark for the basic story, but his major contribution was to fill out that story with additional teaching material, to give a richer account of the Christian way of life. Let's leave aside the question of who exactly wrote Matthew's Gospel in the form we have it. In the grand scheme of things, the important thing is the reliability of the tradition that provides the material, rather than whether the author was an eyewitness or not. From now on, we'll just call the author Matthew, because that's the name everyone uses. So what is Matthew trying to do that is different from Mark? One thing that we have already suggested is that he wants to downplay any tensions between Jewish and non-Jewish Christians hanging over from the recent past. More positively, he seems to want to demonstrate that Christianity genuinely belongs in the Jewish tradition. We see this in the way he tells the story of Jesus' birth, beginning with a genealogy all the way from Abraham to Joseph, son of David. We can notice an interesting contrast. Mark's Gospel begins, "The good news of Jesus, the Messiah, Son of God." But Matthew's begins with, "The book of the birth of Jesus, son of David, son of Abraham." Mark's language, possibly for non-Jewish Christians living in Rome or in Alexandria, is politically subversive. The Roman emperor is the only official son of God in town. Matthew, however, is clearly more interested in establishing Jesus' credentials as Messiah, fully within the Jewish tradition. But he may also have a diplomatic reason for avoiding the politically charged language of Mark. At the time he was writing, Jewish communities across the empire were working hard to rehabilitate their image with the Roman authorities after the disastrous revolt of 66 to 70. Any hint of mutinous messianic language was worth avoiding. In the Branch 2 podcasts, we saw how Matthew's account of Jesus' birth is filled with resonances and prophetic themes which situate his birth as an integral part of the history of the people of Israel. But this prequel to the narrative inherited from Mark also provides an opportunity to shape distinctively the theological expectations of the reader before the full story of Jesus' ministry begins. Let's have a look at some of the way he nudges our thinking. In a dream, Joseph learns that the child's name is Jesus. Matthew explains the name not simply as God saves, but specifically as He will save his people from their sins. This taps into an existential theme, not just in Judaism, but in the wider ancient world. For many peoples, the guilt that came with wrongdoing came with a sense of a disruption of the relationship with God or the gods, and a fear of divine punishment. Ritual mechanisms managed by priests and prophets aimed to restore that relationship and free people both from guilt and from the fear of punishment. For Jews, many of the temple rituals provided a complex mechanism for that release. But we have also seen that at this time among the people, there was the deeper fear of a cosmic punishment for the whole people, indeed the whole world, because of their cumulative sins. We are given a vivid picture of this later in the Gospel, where we see people streaming to John the Baptist, fleeing the wrath that is to come. John's baptism ritual, which will be taken up in the Christian practice of baptism, is clearly felt to be an escape route from that divine wrath. So right from the outset, Matthew identifies the child as the one whose mission is to bring a definitive release from sin, and from all those fears, whether those arising from personal failure or those arising from the sense of impending cosmic judgment. The task has priestly overtones as much as royal ones. He is to repair the damaged relationship between the people and God. Nevertheless, there are important religious royal models as well, who appear in Matthew's genealogy right at the beginning. Alongside David, the ideal Messiah king, we find Hezekiah, the 8th century king who listened to the teaching of Isaiah. We find Josiah, the 7th century king, who not only listened to Jeremiah, but who promulgated an early form of the law of Moses. And of course, Matthew, like Luke, announces that the child is miraculously conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. This miraculous virgin birth fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah, in the Greek translation familiar to Matthew's readers. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Matthew then makes an express link with the child of the prophecy, whose Hebrew name, Emmanuel, means God is with us. So the child is not only a son of David and a son of Abraham. He is not only the royal heir who will free the people from sin and restore their relationship with God. He is here also presented as a living symbol of the holy and saving presence of God in the midst of the people. That the act of rescue also involves tragedy and suffering is brought home with Herod's brutal slaughter of the firstborn. Joseph plays the role of the rescuer, echoing the Joseph of Genesis, bringing the family to safety in Egypt. But Herod himself plays the role of the later Pharaoh of Exodus, who orders the death of the male Israelites. In the background hovers the story of the Exodus itself. I brought my son out of Egypt. God's rescue of God's people that is not accomplished without a sacrifice. Finally, Matthew's Gospel taps into the prophetic promises in Isaiah and elsewhere that all nations will stream to God's holy mountain to worship the one true God in universal peace. The Magi, Persian astrologer priests, represent the nations who do not have the Torah and the prophets, but who are still able to respond to the promises of God and recognize through the universal language of the cosmos that this newborn infant is a gift for their world. Matthew's Gospel will accentuate a pattern already present in Mark, in which Jesus' mission transitions from a purely Jewish one to one that opens out to non-Jews as well. In the first half of the Gospel, Jesus will send out his disciples with a mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel only. But at the end, Jesus instructs his disciples to go make disciples of all the peoples. All told, this gives us a glimpse of how Matthew, as a Jewish Christian, makes sense of a message proclaimed first to his own people and then extended to the whole world. For him, Jesus is the great teacher, presenting the authentic wisdom of God. There is a fundamental confidence that the Jewish tradition interpreted by the words and actions of Jesus contains life-changing and life-giving wisdom that can be passed on to all people, regardless of ethnic origin. The wider Jewish world was reorienting itself understanding around the wisdom of the Torah, according to the teaching tradition of the rabbis. Matthew's Jewish Christians receive in this gospel, more than in any other, a compendium of Jesus' own alternative teaching and exegesis of the law. For Matthew, that teaching both reveals the deepest senses of the law and the prophets and provides important practical guidance for Christians, whether they come from Jewish or Gentile communities. So where is Matthew writing? A common suggestion is that he was writing in Antioch, a Greek city with a large Greek-speaking Jewish population. Since the early Christian communities there were by and large Jewish and saw no reason to abandon Jewish practices, many had been able to continue to be members of synagogue communities. It seems likely that this began to change with the destruction of the temple and the dominance of the emerging rabbinic tradition. Now, Christian interpretations of Torah were being challenged, and their relation to the practice of non-Jewish Christian communities made them particularly suspect. Matthew's Gospel seems to be searching for a middle way here. He needs to defend the broad approach of Jesus to interpreting the law and to affirm its authenticity against Jewish critics. At the same time, he needs to acknowledge and make space for non-Jewish Christians without imposing Jewish practice on them wholesale, in spite of reservations that members of the Jewish Christian community might have about that. We can see perhaps how carefully he treads this fine line in this passage from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. This passage is unique to Matthew, though it shows some resonance with sayings of Jesus recorded by Luke. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Indeed, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one dot or stroke shall pass away from the law until all comes to pass. Whoever unbinds one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever performs it and teaches it, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Notice three things. The first is the ambiguity of the word fulfill. The second is the connection made between the end of the law and the end of the world. The third is absence of any outright condemnation of the one who unbinds one of the least of these commands. What does it mean to fulfill the law and the prophets? Well, it could mean to do exactly what the Torah says and what the prophets require. But we can remember that Jesus and his followers are committed to prophetic reading of Scripture. Christians claim that the law and the prophets is actually about Jesus, his life, death and resurrection. For Jesus, and for Matthew's Jesus, fulfilling the law and the prophets is about the person and mission of Jesus fulfilling the deep prophetic meaning of the sacred texts. What about the end of the world? Let's look at that connection between the law and the order of the cosmos. At a deep level, in some theologies, the practice of the law, and particularly the temple rituals, takes on a cosmic significance. What we do here mirrors what goes on in the cosmic realm. So when this world ends, so too do our ritual practices. Again, Matthew may be playing with a creative ambiguity here. Does the end of the world mean the end of this cosmic order, which clearly has not yet happened? Or does it mean the end of the temple, which clearly has happened? Or does it mean, as St. Paul suggests, the death and resurrection of Christ, in which the new creation has begun? Different readers can read this passage in different ways. Finally, in the one passage that plainly talks about keeping or failing to keep specific commandments, the criticism of those who so fail is striking for its lack of teeth. Perhaps there is a nod to the tensions of previous decades between Paul and the other apostles. Those who insisted on full Torah observance are honoured, but those who, like Paul, argued for minimal compliance are not in the end excluded from the kingdom. This is a text that can be read by a wide range of Christian readers, from the Torah observant to the Torah light. The latter might read it with one or two gulps. But perhaps we can see in it one of the things that Matthew might be trying to achieve in the way he puts his gospel together. We'll look at some more aspects of his approach in the next podcast.